Avengers. Infinity War is one of those rare blockbuster films where the audience walks into the theater, already carrying a strange kind of knowledge. We know these heroes. We know the rules. We have watched them survive invasions, assassinations, explosions, civil wars, cosmic monsters, artificial intelligence, and entire armies. We have watched them lose people and somehow find a way forward. So when the first heroes begin turning to dust, something feels different. It is not simply that characters are dying. It is that the movie has finally removed the invisible safety net that had existed beneath almost every Marvel story before it. For 10 years, the Marvel Cinematic Universe taught audiences to believe that no matter how impossible the situation became, there would eventually be a comeback. Infinity War looks directly at that expectation and asks what happens when the comeback does not arrive. The answer is devastating. Heroes disappear. Friends vanish. Families are separated. And the villain walks away victorious. Yet somehow, that defeat feels less like a failure of storytelling than the culmination of everything Marvel had been building toward. That is the strange achievement of Infinity War. It turns losing into the central dramatic event. The heroes are not defeated because they suddenly become incompetent. They are defeated because their greatest strengths become weaknesses. Tony Stark's determination becomes an obsession with controlling catastrophe. Thor's courage becomes revenge. Wanda's love becomes an impossible vulnerability. Peter Parker's bravery cannot protect him from the consequences of a war far beyond his understanding. Doctor Strange's intelligence leads him toward a decision that only makes sense when the future is taken into account. Even Steve Rogers, perhaps the most morally consistent hero in the entire universe, discovers that principles alone cannot guarantee survival. And standing at the center of all of it is Thanos, a villain who does not see himself as a monster. He sees himself as the only person willing to make the decision everyone else is too afraid to make. That belief is horrifying precisely because the movie takes the time to understand it. Infinity War does not ask us to agree with Thanos. It asks us to enter his mind long enough to understand why he believes he is right. And that distinction becomes essential, because the more clearly we understand his philosophy, the more disturbing its consequences become. He talks about balance while committing unimaginable violence. He speaks about sacrifice while deciding the fate of billions. He claims to love while destroying the person he loves most. The contradiction is the heart of the movie. Because beneath all the cosmic battles and glowing stones, Infinity War is really about a question that superhero films usually avoid. What happens when saving the greater number of people requires you to sacrifice someone you cannot bear to lose? Conventional superhero storytelling tends to promise that the hero will find a third option. The bomb will be stopped. The villain will be defeated. The sacrifice will somehow be avoided. Infinity War deliberately removes that comfort. Again and again, characters are forced into choices where every possible answer carries a cost. Gamora must confront the truth of her relationship with Thanos. Wanda must consider destroying Vision. Tony must decide how far he is willing to go to protect a future he has barely begun imagining. Thor must decide whether revenge is more important than survival. And Doctor Strange, after looking through millions of possible futures, makes a choice that the audience cannot fully understand until the story continues beyond this film. That is why the snap feels so different from an ordinary superhero death. It is not an isolated tragedy. It is the accumulation of 10 years of emotional history collapsing at once. Peter Parker is not simply another character who disappears. He is Tony Stark's responsibility, his fear, his surrogate son, and the living proof that Tony's deepest anxiety has become real. T'Challa is not simply a king who vanishes. He represents the future of Wakanda, and one of the most important cultural expansions of the MCU. Bucky's disappearance hurts because Steve Rogers has spent years refusing to abandon him. Wanda's disappearance comes after she has already sacrificed Vision. Groot disappears after becoming part of a family that was never supposed to exist. And when Doctor Strange turns to dust, the moment carries another layer because he knows something the audience does not. He has seen the possible futures. He has calculated the impossible equation. His final expression is not merely fear. It is recognition. The movie has been moving towards something we cannot yet see. In that sense, the snap is not really the ending. It is the point. It is the moment when Marvel takes everything the audience has invested and suddenly makes us feel its fragility. The question is no longer whether the heroes can win. The question becomes what their defeat means. And to understand why that defeat was powerful enough to dominate conversations around the world, we have to step backward and examine how Marvel built the machine capable of producing it. Because Infinity War was never just another sequel. It was the result of an unprecedented experiment in long-form cinematic storytelling. One that began with a single armored hero in 2008, and gradually transformed into a universe where characters from completely different genres could stand beside one another and still feel emotionally connected. That journey matters because Infinity War's power depends on accumulated history. Without that history, the snap is shocking. With it, the snap becomes personal. The scale of what Marvel attempted in Infinity War is difficult to appreciate if we only look at the finished film. On paper, it sounds almost impossible. Bring together the Avengers, the Guardians of the Galaxy, Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, Black Panther, the surviving Asgardians, and dozens of supporting characters. Give each of them a meaningful dramatic purpose. Move between Earth, space, Titan, Vormir, Wakanda, Nowhere, and Nidavellir. Introduce or continue multiple character arcs. Advance a villain's 10-year storyline. Build toward another enormous film. And somehow make the whole thing feel like a single story, rather than a collection of unrelated crossover scenes. Yet that was precisely the challenge Marvel Studios had spent years preparing for. The MCU's greatest structural advantage was that it did not begin with Infinity War. It began with individual stories that gradually trained audiences to accept the idea of a shared cinematic universe. Iron Man established Tony Stark. The Incredible Hulk expanded the world. Thor introduced Asgard. Captain America established Steve Rogers and the mythology of the Infinity Stones. The Avengers proved that characters who had previously existed in separate franchises could occupy the same narrative space. Then Marvel kept building. The Tesseract became more important. Loki became connected to larger cosmic forces. The Mind Stone appeared inside Vision's origin. The Reality Stone entered the story through the ether. The Power Stone became central to Guardians of the Galaxy. The Time Stone arrived through Doctor Strange. One object after another was quietly positioned until the audience could look backward and realize that Marvel had been assembling a puzzle for years. Thanos himself appeared long before he became the central character. His first major tease in the Avengers was almost absurdly brief, but it planted the idea that Loki's invasion was not the end of the story. Someone larger was watching. Someone more patient was waiting. By the time Josh Brolin's Thanos became the central dramatic force of Infinity War, audiences had already spent years hearing his name, seeing his silhouette, and watching the Infinity Stones move from one story to another. That gave Marvel something most villains never receive: anticipation without complete understanding. We knew Thanos mattered long before we knew exactly what he wanted. That mystery was important because the filmmakers eventually had to solve an enormous problem. How do you make a character powerful enough to challenge an entire cinematic universe without reducing him to a generic supervillain? The answer was to make him the emotional center. Anthony and Joe Russo, following their work on Captain America, The Winter Soldier and Captain America: Civil War, brought an approach that was particularly useful for this challenge. Their strength was not simply action. It was conflict between characters who had competing values. The Winter Soldier had transformed superhero spectacle into political thriller. Civil War transformed superhero spectacle into an ideological argument between friends. Infinity War expanded that philosophy onto a cosmic scale. Instead of asking only which hero would defeat which villain, the movie constantly asks which value should win when values collide. Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely faced a similarly difficult task as writers. They had to manage characters who had already accumulated years of development, while introducing new combinations and ensuring that each scene pushed the larger story forward. The solution was not to give everyone equal screen time. That would have been impossible. Instead, the film grouped characters according to emotional compatibility. Tony, Strange, and Peter form one unusual team. Thor joins Rocket and Groot. Steve reunites with Bucky while working alongside Wanda and Vision. The Guardians collide with Thor. Each group has its own tone. Each group reveals something different about the characters. The result is an enormous ensemble that still feels organized around a central conflict. But the biggest creative decision was making Thanos the narrative center. That choice changed the entire structure. In a traditional superhero film, the villain exists primarily to challenge the protagonist. In Infinity War, the villain has his own journey. He begins with a goal, encounters obstacles, travels across different worlds, loses and gains emotional ground, makes sacrifices, and ultimately reaches his destination. The Avengers are constantly reacting to him. Thanos is the character moving forward. That reversal is one of the film's most important innovations. The heroes are trying to stop the story. Thanos is trying to complete it. And because the audience knows the title is Infinity War, there is a growing sense that the conflict cannot be resolved easily. The movie also had to make Thanos emotionally understandable, without allowing that understanding to become endorsement. That distinction shaped the entire production. His relationship with Gamora was especially important because it gave his ideology a personal contradiction. If Thanos truly believes individual lives are merely numbers in a cosmic equation, why does Gamora matter to him? If he can sacrifice anything for his mission, why does her death hurt him? The answer creates the film's most disturbing paradox. Thanos is capable of love, but he believes love must ultimately submit to his idea of destiny. His emotional capacity does not redeem him. It makes his choices more horrifying. He is not incapable of understanding love. He understands it and still chooses destruction. That is why the production had to make Thanos feel like a person rather than an animated obstacle. Josh Brolin's performance became crucial. His face, eyes, pauses, posture, and vocal rhythm had to carry scenes in which he was surrounded by digital environments and characters. The audience needed to believe that this enormous purple figure could sit quietly, speak softly, touch Gamora's face, and still feel more dangerous than an army. Visual effects could create his body, but performance had to create his humanity. That challenge extended across the entire film. Wakanda required enormous digital environments and armies. Titan needed to feel alien without becoming emotionally distant. Vormir had to look almost empty because its emptiness reinforces the horror of the choice made there. Nidavellir needed to feel mythic enough to justify Thor's quest for Stormbreaker. Nowhere had to preserve the strange cosmic personality established by the Guardians films. And all of these locations had to exist inside one coherent visual world. This was not simply a matter of creating impressive images. The images had to support the story. A landscape could not merely be beautiful. It had to communicate isolation, danger, power, or inevitability. Infinity War's visual effects therefore function as part of its storytelling language. The same is true of the Infinity Stones. Each stone represents a different form of power, but as Thanos collects them, they also become visual markers of shrinking hope. Every new stone means the heroes have fewer options. The audience does not need a character to explain this. We can see it. The gauntlet becomes heavier with meaning as the story progresses. By the time Thanos possesses almost all 6 stones, the object has transformed from a piece of comic book mythology into a symbol of absolute control. And that brings us to the cultural landscape in which the film arrived. By 2018, Marvel was no longer simply a successful movie studio. It had become a cultural ecosystem. Black Panther had arrived only months earlier, and expanded the MCU's cultural reach even further. The Avengers had existed for years. Spider-Man had become part of the universe. The Guardians had established their own devoted audience. Doctor Strange had introduced a new kind of magic. Audiences were not waiting for just another Marvel movie. They were waiting for a collision between stories they had been following for a decade. The marketing understood this. Trailers emphasized Thanos, the Infinity Stones, Wakanda, Spider-Man, and the promise of the Avengers and Guardians finally sharing the same screen. Yet Marvel carefully protected the movie's most consequential secret. The snap remained largely hidden. The marketing could show battles, destruction, and characters in danger, but it could not reveal the emotional architecture of the ending. That secrecy became part of the experience. In an era where spoilers can spread across the internet within minutes, Infinity War created a strange social ritual. People warned each other not to spoil the movie. Audiences avoided social media. The phrase "who dies?" became a cultural question before many people had even seen the film. The anticipation was not simply about entertainment. It was about participation. Seeing Infinity War became an event that happened simultaneously across millions of people. And that matters because the movie's emotional impact depended on a shared history. Someone who had watched Iron Man in 2008 had spent 10 years watching Tony Stark evolve from a selfish weapons manufacturer into a hero terrified of failing the people around him. Someone who had followed Steve Rogers had watched him lose his original world and struggle to find a place in the modern one. Someone who had watched Thor had witnessed a prince become a king, and then lose almost everything that defined him. Someone who had followed Wanda and Vision had watched their relationship grow from uncertainty into genuine love. Gamora and Nebula had turned a dysfunctional family into one of the MCU's most complicated emotional relationships. The Guardians had become a chosen family built from damaged individuals who never expected to belong anywhere. By the time Infinity War arrived, the audience was emotionally attached before the plot even began. That is the hidden foundation of the snap. Marvel did not spend 10 years teaching audiences to care about a statistic. It spent 10 years teaching them to care about people. Then, in a matter of minutes, it turned those people into disappearing silhouettes. Before understanding why that worked, however, we have to enter the story itself, because the movie wastes almost no time telling us that this will not be the triumphant Avengers adventure audiences were expecting. Infinity War begins not with celebration, but with defeat. The Asgardian refugee ship is already broken. Survivors from Thor Ragnarok have barely escaped the destruction of their home, and now they are trapped with Thanos. The opening image immediately destroys the comforting assumption that the heroes will always arrive before the disaster. Thanos has already arrived. He already possesses the Power Stone. His army has already overwhelmed the Asgardians. Thor, one of the strongest beings in the universe, is helpless. Loki, who has spent years surviving through manipulation and deception, attempts one final trick. He offers the Tesseract and tries to create an opening. But Thanos is no longer a villain who can be outsmarted by a clever speech. He has become something more frightening. A character who has already anticipated resistance. Heimdall sends Hulk away, choosing survival for Bruce Banner even as he knows the ship is falling. Loki makes his final attempt to kill Thanos, and Thanos kills him. The death is brutal because Loki's history has conditioned the audience to expect one more escape. He has lied, betrayed, changed sides, and survived situations that should have ended him. Here there is no escape. Thanos kills him and the film moves forward. Thor is left broken. The ship is destroyed. The Asgardian survivors are apparently doomed. And then Hulk is thrown toward Earth. The transition is almost violent in its simplicity. One universe ends, another begins, and Bruce Banner crashes into the Sanctum Sanctorum with a warning. Thanos is coming. Doctor Strange and Wong initially treat the situation as another supernatural emergency, but Tony Stark's arrival changes the emotional temperature. Tony is no longer the reckless young man from the first Iron Man. He is someone who has spent years imagining the next catastrophe. The memory of New York still lives inside him. He knows what it feels like to watch an alien army descend on Earth. He knows that being powerful is not the same as being prepared. And beneath his confidence is a fear that has shaped much of his life, the possibility that he will fail again. His conversation with Pepper Potts reveals another layer. Tony wants a future. He imagines a family. He talks about children and dreams that exist beyond the armor. The irony is immediate. The moment Tony begins imagining a life after superheroism, the universe gives him the greatest threat he has ever faced. That contradiction is central to his character. Tony wants control because he is terrified of losing the people he loves. But the more he tries to control the future, the more violently the future resists him. When Ebony Maw and Cull Obsidian arrive, the movie shifts into action. The invasion is fast, chaotic, and strangely intimate, because the stakes are tied to the time stone inside Doctor Strange's possession. Peter Parker appears almost casually at first, still traveling on a school bus. But the sequence quickly reveals the transformation that has already happened inside him. Peter is still a teenager. He still has homework. He still has the awkwardness of adolescence. But he is now stepping into a conflict involving beings who can manipulate reality itself. His decision to join Tony is brave, but Tony's reaction reveals his deeper fear. He does not simply see Spider-Man as another superhero. He sees a kid who should not have to be part of this. That relationship becomes one of the emotional anchors of the entire film. Tony's greatest fear is not that he will die. It is that someone young and vulnerable will die because he failed to protect them. When the heroes are forced into space, that fear becomes even more immediate. Tony, Peter, and Doctor Strange are suddenly removed from Earth and pulled into the larger cosmic conflict. Peter, who once protected a neighborhood in Queens, is now moving through an alien battlefield. The scale of his journey mirrors the scale of the MCU itself. A story that began with ordinary human problems has become cosmic. Yet the emotional core remains personal. Peter wants to help. Tony wants to protect him. Strange wants to protect the Time Stone. Each character is pursuing a different objective, and those objectives will eventually collide. Elsewhere, the Guardians of the Galaxy encounter Thor floating through space. The meeting is funny, but it also establishes a fascinating contrast. Thor arrives carrying grief. The Guardians arrive carrying chaos. Their personalities should clash, and they do. But underneath the comedy is a shared understanding of loss. Thor has lost his home, his father, his hammer, his sister, and now Loki. The Guardians understand grief because their entire identity has been built around damaged people, learning how to function as a family. Rocket immediately recognizes something in Thor, even if he hides it beneath sarcasm. Groot, meanwhile, treats Thor with the casual familiarity of someone who does not understand how important this legendary figure is supposed to be. Thor's goal becomes clear. He wants a weapon powerful enough to kill Thanos. He travels with Rocket and Groot toward Nidavellir, where they meet Eitri, a surviving dwarf whose people have been devastated by Thanos. The creation of Stormbreaker is not merely a weapon-building sequence. It is Thor rebuilding his identity. His old hammer represented the version of Thor, who believed worthiness was something granted to him. Stormbreaker is different. It emerges after Thor has lost almost everything. The weapon becomes a symbol of rebirth, but it also carries the danger of revenge. Thor is not simply trying to save the universe. He wants Thanos to suffer. That distinction becomes critical later. While Thor pursues his weapon, Gamora carries knowledge that could change everything. She knows Thanos is searching for the Soul Stone. She knows that if he obtains all 6 stones, his plan will become unstoppable. Her relationship with Thanos is perhaps the most psychologically complicated in the film. He raised her, abused her, favored her, and destroyed her home. She hates him, but she also knows him better than almost anyone. When the Guardians attempt to stop him on Nowhere, the confrontation becomes personal. Thanos uses the Reality Stone to manipulate the environment itself, turning danger into illusion and illusion into reality. The scene demonstrates why the stones are terrifying. They do not merely increase physical strength. They change the rules. Gamora attacks Thanos because she believes she has killed him. Then the Reality Stone reveals that the entire situation was manipulated. Thanos captures her, and the movie begins forcing her toward the fate she has spent her life fearing. Meanwhile, on Earth, the old fractures within the Avengers become impossible to ignore. Steve Rogers is operating with a smaller group of heroes, separated from Tony after Civil War. He returns to the fight not because the old conflict has been resolved, but because the threat is larger than their disagreement. Bucky Barnes stands beside him again. The reunion carries enormous emotional weight without needing a speech. Steve refused to abandon Bucky in the previous film, and now their relationship becomes part of a much larger war. Vision and Wanda are also together, but their relationship is built around a terrifying secret. Vision carries the Mind Stone. If Thanos wants all 6 stones, Vision is effectively a target simply because he exists. Wanda knows this. Vision knows this. Neither can ignore what it means. The movie has now assembled several different forms of family: biological family, chosen family, romantic love, friendship, loyalty, and ideological responsibility. Thanos is moving toward the stones, but emotionally, he is moving toward the people who represent the contradictions of his philosophy. That is why the story begins to feel less like a collection of battles and more like a single moral collision. Every character carries something Thanos wants, and almost everything he wants is connected to someone they love. When Tony, Strange, Peter, and the Guardians converge on Titan, the film reaches one of its most important structural shifts. Until this point, the heroes have mostly been reacting. Now they have a chance to attack Thanos directly. But even that opportunity begins with misunderstanding. Tony and Peter encounter the Guardians as strangers, and the clash between them creates humor, because both groups are so convinced of their own competence. Yet beneath the comedy is a larger problem. The heroes are fragmented. They are powerful individually, but they do not operate as one unified team. This is one of Infinity War's recurring ideas. The Avengers are strongest when they cooperate, but the universe they inhabit has spent years dividing them through ideology, trauma, and personal conflict. Steve and Tony are separated. Thor is elsewhere. The Guardians have their own priorities. Doctor Strange trusts his own judgment. Every group believes it can solve the problem from its own position. Thanos, by contrast, is terrifyingly unified. His objective never changes. His certainty gives him an advantage that the heroes do not possess. On Titan, Doctor Strange uses the Time Stone to examine possible futures. The number he sees becomes one of the film's most famous pieces of dialogue. 14,605 possible futures. Only one leads to victory. The revelation changes how the audience interprets everything that follows. If Strange has truly seen the future, then the story is no longer simply about what the characters choose in the present. It is also about the possibility that some events must happen for the eventual outcome to occur. That idea creates an unsettling tension between destiny and choice. Strange is not telling the heroes how to win. He is preparing them for a path that may require them to lose. When Thanos arrives on Titan, the philosophical confrontation finally becomes explicit. He speaks calmly about Titan's collapse and describes his proposed solution as the logical conclusion to scarcity. He believes his people refused to listen. He believes he was right. And now he believes the universe faces the same problem. His argument is seductive only because it contains fragments of recognizable truth. Resources can be limited. Civilizations can collapse. People can make destructive choices. But Thanos takes those observations and turns them into a justification for absolute violence. He treats individuals as numbers. The heroes, meanwhile, insist that individual lives cannot be reduced to statistics. This difference is the philosophical foundation of the conflict. When the battle begins, the heroes work together remarkably well. Mantis restrains Thanos. Peter helps remove the gauntlet. Tony and Strange coordinate attacks. For a moment, it looks like the heroes may actually win. That moment is important because Infinity War does not simply remove hope. Creates hope first. It lets the audience imagine that the conventional superhero ending might still happen. Then Star-Lord learns that Gamora is dead. His grief overwhelms him. Mantis cannot control him. He attacks Thanos, and the emotional chaos gives Thanos the opening he needs. The scene is one of the film's most controversial because Quill's decision is understandable and catastrophic at the same time. He is not acting according to a strategic calculation. He is acting as someone who has just learned that the person he loves is gone. His failure becomes another example of the film's central argument. Emotional attachment is both the source of heroism and the source of vulnerability. Thanos escapes. Doctor Strange gives up the Time Stone. Tony is stabbed. For a moment, it seems as though the end has arrived. Yet Thanos does something unexpected. He spares Tony. That choice matters because it confirms that Thanos is not simply pursuing destruction without thought. He has made a calculation. Strange's final statement about reaching the endgame becomes another clue that the events on Titan are part of a larger plan. At the same time, Wakanda prepares for war. Steve Rogers, T'Challa, Wanda, Vision, Bruce Banner, Bucky, Sam Wilson, Black Widow, and the Wakandan forces gather together. Banner struggles with Hulk, who refuses to emerge after their previous encounters. The internal conflict between Banner and Hulk becomes a miniature version of the film's larger struggle between fear and courage. Banner wants Hulk when he needs strength, but Hulk has his own will. Shuri attempts to remove the Mind Stone from Vision, creating a potential solution that could save both Vision and the universe. Yet the process takes time. Outside, the Outriders arrive. The battle begins. Wakanda becomes a war zone. And just when the heroes appear overwhelmed, Thor arrives with Stormbreaker. The entrance is designed as one of the film's greatest moments of triumph. The music rises. The battlefield changes. The heroes react with disbelief. Thor appears to have become exactly what they need. For a few seconds, Infinity War feels like a conventional superhero movie again. The hero has arrived. The weapon is powerful. The army is collapsing. The villain's forces are being destroyed. The audience is encouraged to believe that victory has finally arrived. But Infinity War has been teaching us not to trust those moments. The greatest danger is often hidden inside the moment that feels most triumphant. That same pattern reaches its emotional extreme on Vormir. Gamora and Thanos travel to a world that feels unlike the other locations in the film. It is empty, barren, and almost silent. The emptiness matters because there is nowhere to hide from the choice waiting there. The Red Skull explains the price of the Soul Stone. Someone Thanos loves must be sacrificed. Gamora initially laughs because she believes the idea is impossible. She has spent her life believing that Thanos is incapable of genuine love. If he truly loves her, then he cannot sacrifice her. But the movie turns that assumption against her. Thanos cries. He mourns. And then he pushes her from the cliff. The Soul Stone appears. The scene is horrifying because it confirms that Thanos can love Gamora and still kill her. In his worldview, love does not invalidate sacrifice. Proves the sacrifice has value. This is one of the most important distinctions in the film. Thanos believes sacrifice makes his choice morally meaningful. The movie quietly suggests the opposite. A sacrifice can be tragic without being righteous. A person can be willing to suffer without having the moral authority to decide that someone else must die. Gamora's death therefore becomes more than a plot mechanism. It exposes the flaw at the center of Thanos' philosophy. He mistakes willingness to sacrifice for moral correctness. He assumes that because he is prepared to lose something precious, his goal must be noble. But suffering does not automatically make an ideology true. The same question returns in Wakanda through Wanda and Vision. Vision knows that the Mind Stone must be destroyed. He asks Wanda to kill him before Thanos arrives. Wanda refuses because she loves him. Vision tells her that the stone cannot be allowed to survive. She finally accepts the terrible responsibility. Wanda destroys Vision. For a brief moment, it appears that she has succeeded. The Mind Stone is gone. Vision is dead. Wanda has made the sacrifice. But then Thanos arrives with the Time Stone. He reverses time. Vision is restored. And then Thanos removes the Mind Stone himself. Wanda's sacrifice becomes meaningless in the immediate sense. This is another devastating rejection of conventional superhero logic. The heroes make the correct sacrifice and still lose. Thor arrives with Stormbreaker and attacks Thanos. He drives the weapon into Thanos' chest. Thor has his revenge within reach. But Thanos tells him that he should have gone for the head. Then he activates the stones. The snap happens almost quietly. There is no enormous explosion. No dramatic speech announces the end. The universe simply changes. Bucky looks down at his hand as it begins to disappear. T'Challa falls. Groot fades away. Wanda turns to dust. Sam disappears. Across the universe, characters vanish. And then Peter Parker realizes what is happening. His fear is immediate. He clings to Tony. He says he does not want to go. The moment becomes unbearable because Peter is not speaking like a superhero. He is speaking like a frightened child. Tony cannot save him. The man who has spent years trying to control every possible catastrophe can do nothing. Peter disappears. Doctor Strange follows. His final look toward Tony carries the weight of knowledge. He has seen the future. He knows this had to happen. Nick Fury and Maria Hill disappear on Earth, but Fury manages to send a signal before he vanishes. The pager becomes the final thread connecting the catastrophe to a future answer. The movie has reached the point where every expectation has been reversed. The Avengers lose. Thanos wins. The title Infinity War suddenly means something more literal than anyone expected. This is not a war in which the heroes narrowly survive. It is a war in which half of existence is erased. And then the movie does something even stranger. It becomes quiet. After the snap, there is no immediate celebration. No final battle, no heroic speech. Tony is stranded on Titan with Nebula. Steve remains in Wakanda, devastated. Rocket is left without most of the Guardians. The surviving characters are surrounded by absence. The action that previously filled the screen has suddenly disappeared, replaced by emotional emptiness. Thanos retreats to a quiet rural landscape. He watches the sunrise. He sits down. He smiles faintly. The villain is peaceful. The heroes are broken. The contrast is almost surreal. Traditional superhero films usually end by rewarding the audience with catharsis. The villain is defeated, the music rises, and the heroes stand together. Infinity War does the opposite. It gives catharsis to Thanos. He has completed his mission. He believes he has saved the universe. The heroes are left to confront failure. That is why the ending became such a powerful cliffhanger. It does not simply ask what happens next. It asks what happens to people after they lose everything. The post-credit scene extends that feeling. Nick Fury realizes what is happening and tries to respond, but even he cannot escape the snap. His pager signal becomes a final act of communication before he disappears. Captain Marvel is teased, but the immediate emotional reality remains unchanged. The universe has been cut in half, and the audience is left with a question that Infinity War deliberately refuses to answer. If the heroes cannot win through strength, what can they possibly do next? The answer would eventually become the foundation of Endgame. But before that answer arrives, Infinity War asks us to understand the characters who created this tragedy. And that brings us back to the strangest structural decision in the entire film. The Avengers are the heroes, but Thanos is the protagonist. Thanos possesses something most blockbuster villains rarely receive: narrative ownership. The story follows his objective, his journey, his obstacles, and his emotional transformation. He begins with the belief that the universe is suffering from scarcity. He gathers the Infinity Stones one by one. He loses Gamora. He reaches the final battlefield. He completes his mission. Structurally, that is a protagonist's journey. The Avengers are essentially the opposing force. They are trying to stop him from completing the story he has chosen for himself. This reversal is one reason the film feels so different from earlier MCU installments. The movie does not simply ask whether the heroes can defeat Thanos. It asks whether the heroes can understand the kind of threat he represents. Tony Stark is particularly important because his personal journey mirrors Thanos in a distorted way. Tony is obsessed with preventing catastrophe. After New York, he becomes convinced that another invasion will come. He builds armor, plans defenses, and imagines threats before they happen. His fear is understandable, but fear can become control. Tony wants to protect everyone, yet the desire to protect can lead to decisions that isolate him. His relationship with Peter exposes this vulnerability. Peter is young, enthusiastic, and reckless, but Tony sees him as someone he is responsible for. Peter becomes a symbol of the future Tony wants to protect. That is why his death is devastating. Tony's worst fear becomes reality. Thor follows a different path. His story is defined by grief. He has lost Asgard, Odin, Mjolnir, Heimdall, Loki, and countless people he was supposed to protect. Instead of accepting the loss, Thor turns toward revenge. Stormbreaker becomes the physical expression of that obsession. He believes that if he can kill Thanos, the pain will have meaning. But the film ultimately shows how revenge can distort responsibility. Thor gets the weapon. He gets the opportunity. He wounds Thanos. And he still fails because he wants the satisfaction of knowing his enemy suffered rather than simply ensuring the threat was eliminated. Steve Rogers represents another philosophy. Steve's strength comes from consistency. He refuses to abandon people even when the cost is enormous. His loyalty to Bucky has survived war, manipulation, ideological conflict, and years of separation. His instinct is always to protect the individual standing beside him. That makes his conflict with the larger Avengers philosophy particularly interesting. Vision's life may represent billions of lives if the Mind Stone remains in Thanos' reach. Yet Steve does not immediately accept the idea that Vision should simply be sacrificed. He believes there must be another way. Peter Parker represents growth under pressure. He begins the film as a teenager who wants to help, but the scale of the crisis forces him to mature quickly. His jokes and excitement gradually give way to fear. When he dies, the transformation is complete. The superhero identity disappears, leaving only Peter. Wanda's journey is even more painful. She is asked to destroy the person she loves because the greater good demands it. She hesitates, then chooses sacrifice. Her tragedy is that the sacrifice does not stop Thanos. Vision dies twice. Wanda loses him twice. Doctor Strange, meanwhile, embodies calculation. He is willing to make decisions based on future probabilities rather than immediate emotion. That makes his final disappearance especially intriguing. He knows something the others do not. His willingness to give up the Time Stone may appear irrational until we consider that he has already seen the future. In this sense, the heroes represent different responses to uncertainty. Tony tries to control it. Thor tries to destroy it. Steve resists abandoning people to it. Wanda suffers through it. Strange calculates it. Thanos claims to have eliminated it. He believes destiny has chosen him. That certainty is what makes him so dangerous. The psychology of Thanos becomes clearer when we understand where his philosophy comes from. Titan was not simply a planet he loved. It was the origin of his worldview. He believed his civilization was approaching collapse because its population had grown beyond the resources available to sustain it. He proposed eliminating half the population. His people rejected the idea. Eventually, Titan collapsed. Thanos interpreted that collapse as proof that he had been right. This is the foundation of his savior complex. He does not see himself as someone creating suffering. He sees himself as someone correcting an imbalance that everyone else is too sentimental to confront. The problem is that his logic depends on a deeply flawed assumption that killing half of all life is the only possible solution. He treats the universe like a mathematical equation, and himself like the person qualified to solve it. The Infinity Stones give him the power to manipulate reality, time, space, matter, energy, and souls. But the greater irony is that the stones do not make him wise. They simply make his existing worldview more powerful. This is why Thanos is more disturbing than a villain who wants destruction for its own sake. He wants purpose. He believes the suffering he causes is necessary. His calm demeanor reinforces that belief. He rarely needs to shout. He rarely needs to threaten. He speaks as though the outcome has already been decided. Certainty becomes his weapon. His relationship with Gamora exposes the contradiction. He claims to love her. He favors her over Nebula. He recognizes her strength, but his love is possessive. He sees her as proof that he was right to shape her. When he sacrifices her on Vormir, he interprets his grief as evidence of the cost of his mission. But the film does not allow his tears to erase the violence. Thanos' emotional pain is real, but his moral conclusion is still wrong. That distinction is essential. Understanding a villain is not the same as excusing him. Thanos' relationship with Nebula reveals another side of his philosophy. He sees weakness as something to be corrected. Nebula's body is repeatedly modified because she loses against Gamora. Instead of understanding her pain, he treats her as a failed product. His love for Gamora is therefore selective and conditional. He can be tender toward her while being cruel toward someone else. This selective empathy mirrors the larger problem in his ideology. He claims to care about all life, but his solution begins by deciding that half of life is disposable. He claims to value balance, but he alone gets to define what balance means. He claims to create freedom for future generations, yet he imposes his will on every living being in the universe. The contradiction is enormous. Thanos believes he is removing suffering, but he never asks whether the people he kills consent to his solution. He believes he is creating a better future, but he never considers the possibility that life might be capable of solving its own problems. His worldview is therefore not really about balance. It is about control disguised as balance. That is why his final peaceful retirement is so unsettling. He does not experience himself as a conqueror. He believes the work is finished. He watches the sunrise because he thinks he has saved existence. The peacefulness of that moment is not comforting. It is horrifying because it shows how completely he has rationalized what he has done. The supporting characters make the film work because their relationships prevent the story from becoming a parade of individual superheroes. Tony and Peter are perhaps the clearest example. Their relationship combines mentorship, responsibility, affection, and fear. Tony wants Peter to become stronger, but he also wants him to remain safe. Peter wants Tony's approval, but he also wants to prove that he belongs among the heroes. Their dynamic is funny in some scenes and heartbreaking in others, because the emotional foundation has already been established. Tony and Doctor Strange create a different relationship. Both are brilliant, arrogant, and confident in their own judgment. They argue because neither likes surrendering control. Yet they are capable of recognizing each other's competence. Tony and Nebula, stranded together after the snap, become an unlikely pairing. Their shared isolation strips away much of their usual personality and leaves two survivors confronting the consequences of failure. Steve and Bucky represent loyalty. Their relationship is built around the idea that a person is more than the damage done to them. Steve's refusal to abandon Bucky becomes one of the clearest expressions of the film's rejection of Thanos' numerical worldview. Steve does not calculate Bucky's value. He simply knows that Bucky matters. Steve and T'Challa create another contrast. Both are leaders, but their leadership styles differ. T'Challa represents a king responsible for an entire nation. Steve represents an individual soldier who follows principle even when institutions fail him. Their alliance works because both understand that leadership requires protecting people, not simply winning battles. Wanda and Vision provide the emotional center of the Mind Stone conflict. Their relationship asks whether love can survive when one person is literally carrying the object that threatens the universe. Vision's willingness to die contrasts with Wanda's inability to accept his sacrifice. Their conflict is not about weakness. It is about two different forms of love. Thor's relationship with Rocket and Groot is almost the opposite. It begins as comedy, but gradually becomes another chosen family. Rocket recognizes grief beneath Thor's bravado. Groot treats Thor as a companion rather than a legend. Their journey to Nidavellir gives Thor something he desperately needs: people who will stand beside him without requiring him to explain his pain. The Guardians themselves provide a similar function. Star-Lord's humor hides insecurity. Gamera's confidence hides trauma. Drax uses bluntness to avoid emotional vulnerability. Mantis processes emotion almost literally. Rocket hides affection behind anger. Groot communicates through a limited vocabulary, while remaining emotionally expressive. The group should not work, yet they do. Their family is proof that people can create belonging from damage. That makes Gamera's death even more painful. The Guardians are not simply losing a teammate. They are losing part of the structure that made them a family. Peter Parker's interactions with them add another layer of comedy and generational contrast. He is younger, more enthusiastic, and more impressed by superhero mythology. The Guardians are more cynical and chaotic. Their exchanges keep the film from becoming emotionally exhausting. That balance is important. Infinity War contains enormous amounts of grief, but it constantly uses humor to create breathing room. Drax's literal reactions, Mantis' awkwardness, Rocket's insults, Thor's exaggerated confidence, Peter's references, and Tony's sarcasm prevent the film from collapsing under its own seriousness. The comedy is not separate from the tragedy. It makes the tragedy possible by reminding us what these characters are like when they are not suffering. The same principle applies to Bruce Banner and Hulk. Banner cannot summon Hulk when he needs him most, turning an internal disagreement into a source of tension. Shuri provides scientific intelligence rather than battlefield power. Wong grounds Doctor Strange. Mantis provides emotional sensitivity. Black Panther provides leadership. Each character contributes a different function. That is how an enormous ensemble remains emotionally legible. Instead of asking every character to do everything, the film lets relationships define them. At the center of Infinity War is a conflict between two moral systems: the value of the individual and the logic of the collective. Thanos believes that the universe can be saved by sacrificing half of its population. His logic resembles a brutal form of utilitarian calculation, where the outcome is judged by numbers. If half must die so that the other half can live, he considers the equation acceptable. The heroes repeatedly challenge that logic, even when they cannot articulate it philosophically. Steve's refusal to abandon Bucky matters because Bucky is not a number. Wanda's pain matters because Vision is not a resource. Tony's terror matters because Peter is not an interchangeable soldier. Gamora matters because she is Gamora. This is the emotional argument beneath the spectacle. The film understands that audiences do not grieve statistics. They grieve people. Thanos wants to transform existence into mathematics. The movie keeps transforming mathematics back into relationships. That is why sacrifice becomes so complicated. Sacrifice can be heroic when someone chooses to give themselves for others. But Infinity War asks what happens when someone else makes that choice for them. Vision chooses death. Wanda is asked to make the decision. Gamora is sacrificed without consent. The difference is enormous. A sacrifice chosen freely can express love. A sacrifice imposed by another person can become violence regardless of the justification. Thanos tries to blur that distinction. He believes that because he is willing to suffer emotionally, his violence becomes noble. But the film quietly exposes the flaw. Suffering does not grant moral authority. Love can be a strength, but it can also become a vulnerability. Thanos uses Gamora's love and fear against her. Star-Lord's love for Gamora allows Thanos to manipulate him. Wanda's love for Vision makes the Mind Stone impossible to destroy without devastating her. Tony's affection for Peter makes Peter's danger unbearable. The heroes' relationships are therefore both their greatest strengths and their greatest weaknesses. Division creates another layer. The Avengers are not functioning as one team. Civil War left them fractured. That fracture matters because Thanos arrives at the exact moment when cooperation is most necessary. Tony, Steve, Thor, and the others might have been stronger together, but their history prevents immediate unity. Thanos, meanwhile, has no internal disagreement about his objective. He moves forward with terrifying consistency. The movie therefore creates a contrast between certainty and uncertainty. Thanos is certain that he is right. The heroes are uncertain about how to respond. Strange sees millions of futures because he knows there are no easy answers. Thor chooses revenge because uncertainty is painful. Tony tries to control events because uncertainty terrifies him. Wanda hesitates because every choice causes pain. Heroism in Infinity War is therefore not defined by certainty. It is defined by continuing to act despite uncertainty. That makes the eventual defeat more meaningful. The heroes do not fail because they lack courage. They fail because courage does not guarantee victory. This is one of the film's most mature ideas. Superhero stories often equate goodness with success. Infinity War separates them. A person can make a brave choice and still lose. A person can sacrifice themselves and still fail. A person can be morally right and still be powerless. That distinction is painful, but it is also what gives the film emotional weight. It turns the fantasy of superheroism into a meditation on impermanence. The characters cannot control everything. The audience cannot control everything. And the universe does not guarantee that good intentions produce good outcomes. The visual language reinforces these themes constantly. Thanos is associated with purple, a color that separates him from the heroes while making him visually dominant. He is often framed against enormous environments, but his presence remains strangely intimate. Wakanda and Titan offer contrasting visual worlds. Wakanda is technologically advanced but grounded in living culture, nature, and community. Titan is desolate, broken, and almost post-apocalyptic. One represents a civilization protecting what it has. The other represents the ruins of a civilization Thanos believes he failed to save. The Infinity Gauntlet becomes a visual representation of absolute control. Each stone adds another layer of power until Thanos possesses an object capable of changing reality itself. The Soul Stone is different because its acquisition requires an emotional sacrifice, rather than a physical battle. Vormir's emptiness reflects the irreversibility of the choice. There are no armies, no distractions, no technological solutions, only a cliff and a decision. The Mind Stone is tied directly to Vision's identity. It is both part of him and the object that threatens him. Removing it means saving the universe at the cost of his life. Stormbreaker represents Thor's rebirth, but it also becomes a symbol of revenge. The broken Tesseract and the Space Stone transition from object to power, showing how the Infinity Stones move from mysterious artifacts into instruments of cosmic control. Doctor Strange's circular portals create a visual language of movement and possibility. Spider-Man's movement between ordinary New York life and cosmic battle emphasizes his transition from childhood into a world he cannot fully understand. The dusting effect is perhaps the film's most important visual symbol. Characters do not simply fall. They disintegrate. Their bodies lose solidity. Their identities seem to disappear into the air. The effect is visually beautiful, which makes it emotionally disturbing. There is no body to mourn. There is only absence. That absence becomes even more powerful when the film cuts between different characters experiencing the same fate. The repetition creates a pattern. The audience understands that this is not one death. It is a transformation of reality. Then comes the final image of Thanos in the rural landscape. The destruction of half the universe is followed by a peaceful sunrise. Visually, the film refuses to tell us how to feel. The landscape is calm. The villain is calm. Everything around him appears ordinary. That serenity is disturbing because it contrasts so completely with what the audience has just witnessed. Spectacle has become silence. Destruction has become peace. And the contradiction forces us to confront the perspective of the person who caused it. Beneath all of this lies a philosophical question. Can violence create peace? Thanos believes it can. He believes that by reducing population, he will create abundance. But the film never proves that his solution would work. More importantly, it never grants him the moral authority to make the decision. His argument depends on inevitability. He believes the universe has only one possible path, and that he alone is willing to take it. This resembles a distorted savior complex. He does not merely want power. He wants to be necessary. He wants history to prove that he was right. That desire explains why he talks about future generations thanking him. He imagines himself as the misunderstood architect of a better universe. But there is an enormous philosophical flaw in his reasoning. He treats people as variables. If 1 billion people die and 2 billion survive, he sees the equation rather than the individuals. He cannot understand that every person represents an entire universe of relationships. The movie demonstrates this through its heroes. Peter Parker matters because Tony loves him. Bucky matters because Steve refuses to abandon him. Vision matters because Wanda loves him. Gamora matters because she has spent her entire life trying to escape Thanos' control. When Thanos reduces life to numbers, the heroes respond through relationships. That is why the story's emotional logic ultimately rejects his philosophy. Doctor Strange's calculation might appear similar to Thanos' numerical thinking, because Strange considers millions of possible futures. But the difference is intention. Strange is not deciding that certain lives are worthless. He is trying to find a path that preserves the possibility of survival. Even then, the movie leaves his decision morally complicated. He gives up the time stone and allows Tony to live, but we do not fully understand why until later. Wanda's sacrifice is more personal. She does not calculate millions of lives. She sees one person she loves and is forced to make an unbearable decision. Thor acts from revenge. Tony acts from fear. Steve acts from loyalty. Each hero represents a different response to power and responsibility. Thanos believes power gives him the right to decide. The heroes gradually learn that power creates responsibility without granting ownership over other people's lives. That distinction becomes especially important because Infinity War never pretends that the heroes have easy answers. The movie does not present them as morally perfect. They make mistakes. They argue. They act emotionally. They fail. But their failures are human failures, not ideological certainty. Thanos' greatest danger is not that he is irrational. It is that he is rational in service of a false premise. That is why the movie becomes more interesting after you know the ending. Once the surprise is gone, the philosophical structure becomes easier to see. You begin noticing how often characters are asked whether they will choose an individual or a collective. You notice how frequently Thanos speaks about destiny. You notice how often the heroes resist surrendering people for an abstract goal. And you realize that the snap was never merely a twist. It was the logical consequence of the worldview the movie had been constructing from the beginning. The enormous visual effects achievement behind Infinity War is inseparable from its emotional ambition. Thanos had to feel real. If the audience saw him as an obvious digital creation, the emotional scenes with Gamora would collapse. His face needed subtlety. His eyes needed to communicate affection, grief, anger, certainty, and calculation. Josh Brolin's performance provided the foundation, but digital artists had to translate that performance into a character who was physically unlike the actor. The challenge was not simply realism. It was emotional realism. Thanos needed to be capable of standing among real actors and still feel as though he belonged in the same world. The same challenge applied to Titan, Nowhere, Vormir, Nidavellir, and Wakanda. Each location had to feel distinct while remaining connected to the visual language of the MCU. Wakanda required enormous armies and digital extensions, but its visual identity was rooted in its cultural and technological design. Titan needed emptiness and scale. Vormir needed desolation. Nidavellir needed mythic machinery and cosmic scale. Nowhere needed the strange, industrial personality associated with the Guardians. Even the Infinity Stones required careful visual design, because each had to communicate a different type of power. Stormbreaker had to feel like something capable of challenging the Infinity Gauntlet. Doctor Strange's magic had to look different from Wakandan technology. Iron Man's technology needed to feel mechanical and responsive. Spider-Man's Iron Spider suit had to preserve Peter's physical expressiveness while increasing his abilities. Bruce Banner and Hulk required another level of digital integration, because the audience had to believe that two different identities could inhabit the same body. The Outriders were designed to feel threatening through movement and quantity, rather than personality. Their function was to create the impression of overwhelming biological force. Yet perhaps the most important visual effect is the snap. The dusting could have been designed as a simple disappearance, but the filmmakers chose something more tactile. Bodies become unstable. Dust spreads. Characters lose physical presence. The effect communicates both violence and absence. It is not a traditional death animation. It is a visual metaphor for identity being erased from the world. That is why the effect became instantly recognizable. People could imitate it, parody it, meme it, and reference it because the image itself carried meaning. The visual effect became part of the cultural language of the movie. Anthony and Joe Russo's direction is equally important because Infinity War constantly shifts between genres. The opening feels almost like horror. A familiar heroic world is destroyed before the audience has time to settle in. Titan becomes science fiction mixed with character-driven action. Wakanda becomes a war film. Vormir becomes psychological tragedy. Nowhere becomes confrontation drama. The Guardians bring comedy. Tony and Peter create coming-of-age emotion. Doctor Strange introduces surreal fantasy. Rather than allowing these tones to compete, the directors use them to create variety inside the enormous runtime. Their previous MCU work prepared them for this. The Winter Soldier taught them how to stage grounded action around character conflict. Civil War taught them how to manage multiple heroes with competing loyalties. Infinity War required those skills at a much larger scale. Cross-cutting becomes essential. The movie constantly moves between locations, but the transitions are driven by emotional momentum rather than simple chronology. A scene on Titan can change the meaning of a scene in Wakanda. A decision made on Vormir can echo through the final battle. The directors also understand the importance of scale versus intimacy. The Wakanda battle can contain hundreds of characters, but the camera eventually isolates Wanda and Vision. The Titan battle can involve cosmic powers, but the emotional focus narrows to Tony, Peter, and Strange. The snap itself moves across the universe, but is experienced through individual faces. This balance prevents the film from becoming emotionally anonymous. The pacing is another major achievement. A movie with this many characters could easily become exhausting, yet Infinity War rarely stops moving. Every sequence either advances Thanos' mission, develops a relationship, or creates a new obstacle. The filmmakers do not spend long explaining what the audience already knows. They trust the accumulated history of the MCU. That trust is both a strength and a limitation, because the movie becomes far more effective for viewers who have followed the previous films. But as a piece of franchise filmmaking, that dependency is intentional. Infinity War is not trying to introduce the MCU. It is trying to pay off the investment audiences have already made. The directors understand that the audience itself is part of the narrative structure. 10 years of viewing history becomes a storytelling tool. The film can spend seconds on a relationship that would require an entirely separate movie to establish for a new viewer. That efficiency allows the story to move at enormous speed, while still producing emotional weight. The result is not a perfectly independent film. It is something different. A chapter in a cinematic narrative large enough to function almost like serialized television, but experienced on a theatrical scale. Alan Silvestri's music reinforces that continuity. His return to the Avengers' musical identity connects Infinity War to the earlier films, while allowing the score to become darker and heavier. The Avengers theme carries nostalgia, because audiences already associate it with heroic unity. Hearing it again reminds us of the original promise of the team, but Infinity War constantly complicates that promise. The heroes are no longer unified. The theme becomes a memory of something they once were. Thanos receives a musical identity that feels heavier and more ominous. The score does not need to make him loud because his presence is already threatening. Thor's heroic music gains emotional weight because his journey is now shaped by grief. The Titan sequence uses music to transform a chaotic battle into a moment of possibility. The Wakanda battle receives escalating orchestral energy, building toward Thor's entrance and the false hope that follows. Vormir uses music differently. There, the emotional space is more important than spectacle. The score allows the audience to feel the weight of the choice before it is fully understood. Wanda and Vision's moments are similarly intimate. Tony and Peter's scenes often use music to reinforce the strange combination of mentorship and fear in their relationship. Then, during the snap, the music becomes part of the emotional architecture. As characters disappear, the score supports the transition from action into grief. Eventually, silence becomes more powerful than music. The absence of sound after the snap is itself a statement. The audience has spent hours surrounded by explosions, jokes, weapons, portals, engines, and cosmic energy. Suddenly, the universe feels empty. Sound design carries that same contrast. The Guardians' use of Rubber Band Man immediately establishes their playful identity and connects the audience to the tonal world of their films. The difference between a Guardians sequence and an Avengers sequence can be heard as much as seen. Infinity Stone effects have distinctive sonic qualities. Stormbreaker carries enormous weight. Doctor Strange's magic sounds unlike Iron Man's technology. Wakandan technology has its own texture. Portals create another recognizable sonic signature. These differences allow the audience to navigate a huge universe without constantly needing explanation. Sound becomes world-building. But the most memorable sound is sometimes the lack of it. Peter's final moments are devastating partly because the action around him has quieted. His voice becomes vulnerable. Tony's helplessness becomes audible. The snap itself is not presented as an enormous sonic explosion. The world simply loses people. That restraint makes the scene feel intimate rather than purely spectacular. Even the post-credit sequence uses sound to create urgency. Fury's pager signal becomes a final connection to a future story. Audio continuity, like visual continuity, helps transform separate franchises into one cinematic language. The cultural impact of Infinity War was immediate. The film did not simply release into theaters. It arrived as a global event. Audiences attended midnight screenings. Fans organized around opening weekend viewings. Social media became filled with warnings about spoilers. The question of who would die became almost impossible to avoid. The snap quickly became a piece of pop culture shorthand for sudden mass disappearance. Memes appeared everywhere. People imitated dusting. Lines from Peter's final scene became instantly recognizable. Thor's entrance became one of the most celebrated moments in the film. Thanos himself became a meme, but also a surprisingly serious subject of debate. Was he right about anything? Was his philosophy internally consistent? Was he too sympathetic? Could the Avengers have stopped him earlier? Did Star-Lord ruin the plan? Should Thor have gone for the head? The movie created a rare situation in which a mainstream blockbuster generated philosophical arguments alongside jokes and memes. The spoiler anxiety was especially significant. The snap was so important that audiences treated information about it almost like a secret. People avoided social media. Theaters issued spoiler warnings. Friends negotiated viewing schedules. The experience of seeing the movie became part of the culture surrounding the movie. This is one reason the film became more than a financial success. It became a shared memory for people who experienced it in real time. Someone who saw Infinity War on opening night remembers the audience reaction when the first character disappeared. They remember the silence after Peter's death. They remember people leaving theaters in shock. They remember conversations immediately afterward about what could possibly happen next. That kind of communal experience is difficult to manufacture. It requires years of investment and a story capable of rewarding that investment. Infinity War had both. Its long-term influence is equally significant. The snap became shorthand for sudden disappearance. Its images remained recognizable long after the initial release. Fans recreated scenes, collected merchandise, wore costumes, debated theories, and revisited the film after Endgame changed the meaning of its ending. The film also changed expectations for franchise storytelling. Audiences became more willing to accept cliffhangers when the larger narrative had earned their trust. A studio could end a massive blockbuster with the villain winning, and still generate enormous enthusiasm for the next chapter. That is commercially powerful. It also influenced the broader industry. Shared universes became even more attractive to studios because Infinity War demonstrated what could happen when audiences were emotionally invested across multiple franchises. But the film also revealed the danger of copying the formula without the character investment behind it. A cinematic universe cannot simply be assembled from references. It requires relationships that audiences have spent years learning to care about. Infinity War's cliffhanger works because the characters disappearing are not strangers. They are people the audience has known for years. The film therefore became a case study in event cinema. The event was not simply the size of the battle. It was the accumulated emotional history of the universe.